Therapist perception. So welcome back. This is Reactivity TV. And if you are tuning in on YouTube for the full length Reactivity TV, we are doing this a little bit different today. This is at the end of our podcast episode with Jessica Desai, all about grief. So we talked a lot about grief and loss and supporting those who are going through it and healing ourselves through it. And we thought it was the perfect opportunity to talk about a holiday movie around this time, and a holiday movie that involves a lot of the same types of things we've been talking about. And that movie is The Holiday. So we're going to get into talking about that from our therapist perspective, as per usual. And so, yeah, if you are tuning in on YouTube, then make sure to circle back and listen to the whole episode so you get the full effect. And if you're continuing from the podcast, well, welcome back. And here we go.
Yeah. And this is your first time guest. I mean, well, you are the first guest we ever had in Reactivity TV. And we kind of made a decision based, especially because it's you and because of this movie, because it felt so perfect to be able to kind of invite you in and apply your learnings and what we've just learned from you to this holiday classic, which apparently you've never seen before.
I can't believe that.
Yes, I am one of the only people on this planet who has not seen this movie. Well, I saw it the other day, but up until then, I was one of the only people who had never seen it. And it was so cute. I'm so happy I got to watch it for this podcast.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm glad you liked it also, because we don't critique movies or TV shows anywhere on this. Mm-hmm. But this is one of my favorites.
Greatest movie of all time, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe. It might be in my top 5 or top 10, like outside of Christmas holiday movies. Like, I have to watch it every year. It's just so good.
It's a classic. Yes.
While I was watching it, because I remember before, like leading up to the podcast, you had mentioned that, Catherine. And the whole time I was watching it, I'm like, I get it. I get why Catherine loves this movie. It is just so wholesome.
Yes. Yes. And so, as Catherine was saying, we're not here to critique movies. We're more here to give our therapist perspective, our therapist take on what we're watching, on what we're viewing. And this movie felt so, well, perfect because, it's the holidays and it's the holiday. And it felt like it gave so many different opportunities to look at different types of grief and different ways to process grief. And so I guess with that, I mean, who wants to kick us off? I mean, Jess, do you want to start and just maybe talk about, kind of a main theme or a main takeaway for you as you watch this?
Absolutely. And I just have to say, overall, I was pretty impressed with how, especially, I think it came out in 2006. Like, I'm impressed with its ability, like the movie's ability to really highlight the different ways that people grieve. I was really like, wow, this is so great. While also being so wholesome. It felt real, it felt authentic, and it felt wholesome. And that's kind of just my zoomed out overall impression. But a big takeaway for me is I think they did a really, really great job highlighting 2 specific grieving styles that we were talking about earlier in the podcast, which is the intuitive and instrumental styles of grief. And I know one thing that we were saying earlier is that, it all falls on a spectrum, and both Kate Winslet's character Iris and Cameron Diaz's character Amanda show a little bit of both of intuitive and instrumental grieving throughout the movie. But also start off on seemingly different ends of the spectrum, right? In the beginning, you see Kate Winslet ending of a relationship, really in the intuitive style of grieving, right? She's feeling her feelings. She's going into her house and she cries immediately when she closes the door. It was kind of a little comical how she is feeding her little dog and she's like, and, puts the food on the floor. But it's just a really, very much strongly intuitive style of grief. And we also see further on in the movie when she has the friendship with the older gentleman who's Amanda's neighbor, and really invests her time and her energy into him, and all of that award ceremony for him, and really kind of making that her passion project. You also see her going into that instrumental side of grieving that ending of the complicated relationship, in an instrumental way of taking action. And with Cameron Diaz's character, Amanda, it kind of starts off on a different end of the spectrum of she's kind of also in the ending of a relationship, and she physically cannot cry, right? And that, so she's like, let's go on a vacation. Let's book a trip. Like, that was her immediate response. And again, it highlights a more action-oriented style of, yes, she didn't seem super sad that the relationship was ending, but it was still a loss. And her way of kind of coping with that loss was doing something about it. And I just, it's so silly, all the scenes of her like trying to cry and she can't. But I think overall this movie, in a wholesome, sweet, and sometimes funny way, and in that normalizing this grief process in all the different ways that people can grieve, and all the different styles of grieving, specifically on that spectrum of intuitive versus instrumental. I think that was one of my biggest takeaways from this.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, like I said, I love this movie, and I've seen this movie so many times. I never looked at it in terms of one of them starting on one end and ending on the other, and one of them starting on one end and ending on the other, like that it's flipped. And that's so cool. And I'm glad that you made that connection to the instrumental and intuitive grieving. It's right there.
It was right there. Because you're right too. Because at some point, I don't know if we're like spoiling or not, but
Yeah.
Everyone's seen it but me. But towards the end, Cameron Diaz is able to cry. Mm-hmm. Because she allows herself to get vulnerable in a different way. And again, not that there's something wrong with her that she couldn't cry, not pathologizing it here, but it is interesting how she moves through the different styles, for sure.
Well, and there's so much of her. I think she had said she really hasn't been able to cry since her parents got divorced, right? Mm-hmm. Which is another type of loss. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder, did she really ever process that? Did she really ever process her feelings around that, to allow herself the space, the vulnerability to cry? It wasn't until she really had that moment with Graham's daughters, and they're kind of talking about the Three Musketeers, that we kind of see her kind of feel her feelings. And that to me kind of was a little indicator of like, ooh, there's some unresolved stuff here. And as we talked about earlier on in our overall kind of grief discussion around, like, we allowing ourselves to feel our feelings is a way toward healing. And in this movie, Amanda had sounds like several years in between the initial loss and feeling her feelings. She got there, which is great to see. But yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering about as I was watching is this her unresolved grief coming out here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, she was burying herself in her job, and she was super successful and built up this whole company, and the doing was there. The doing was super present, and that feelings part was totally out there. I mean, when she was breaking up with her boyfriend in the beginning, and he said, I think you're the only person that breaks up with their boyfriend and doesn't cry, doesn't shed a tear.
Mm-hmm. Can we shift in talking about maybe the more obvious grief, which was Graham, Jude Law's character?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Kind of wondering your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yes. I thought it was beautiful. Because again, I knew nothing about this movie. I did not expect that twist about halfway through of, the two women quote unquote calling him on the phone are actually his two daughters. And he is a widower. And that is something that, throughout the first half of the movie, you don't know about him. And you're kind of in Amanda's shoes of like, you find out with her of this whole aspect of his life that he had been hiding and almost like protecting and not really being vulnerable about. He felt the need to protect himself, but I think also his family, and because I believe the loss is still relatively new, like within a couple of years, and he's still figuring it out. And one of the most meaningful moments for me is that like little monologue that he has when they're in his house. And I think they're like in his office or a library. And she's like, why didn't you tell me? And he kind of goes on this tangent of like, it's so much easier for me to just be a normal guy. And when I come home, I'm a full-time working parent. I'm mom and dad. I'm the guy who reads parenting books and cookbooks before I go to bed. I sew. I'm Mr. Napkin Head. And he just talks about how he's on this constant overload and trying to just compartmentalize his life until he figures out how to do this, like how to put himself back out there. And I thought he humanized that experience beautifully. And it's interesting that while through that process of humanizing his grief and just putting it all out there and being vulnerable for him or for himself and for Amanda's character, it's right around that same time that he is able to express that he loves her and that he's able to find love again and really find healing in that vulnerability. And yes, does life always work out that beautifully? Probably not. But I think it's just what felt very real was him talking about his experience with grief and the overwhelm and the practical parts of it, and him just being a human trying to figure it out. And I thought his vulnerability there was so meaningful and again helped him with his healing.
Mm-hmm. Now what about so if he's compartmentalizing these two parts of his life, his mm-hmm. role as a parent and a widower and all of that, and then and he even says to Cameron Diaz that he cries all the time. Mm-hmm. He's a major weeper, and then he also on this other like this normal guy side of his life goes out a lot. He drinks pretty often and gets pretty intoxicated, and he sleeps with a lot of women. And so how would you characterize that kind of grief where he's doing these two things? Are any of these things that he's doing right or wrong? Are any of these things that he's doing actually productive, or all of these things that he's doing productive? What do you think?
That is such a good question. I think the part monologue or like pre him coming into this movie, right, where he's going out drinking, sleeping with a lot of women, doing all of the things, but also crying a lot and also being a dad and all of that. I think that is the overwhelm that he's describing. And I don't know if I would say if it's like good or bad. I just wonder, is it serving him? And that's probably like such a therapist answer, but like, how helpful or unhelpful was that to him? I wonder if it was part of like, I wish I could have him as a client. I wish I could ask him these questions. It'd be nice to have Jude Law as a client. No, I'm kidding. But I think it just is like the messiness of life and he's trying to figure it out. And I would wonder, or I would ask him, is this helpful? Like, do you think this is helpful for you? How is this helping you process what you're going through? And I wonder too, like in thinking about that question, and then he has this monologue of like venting it out loud of everything. Like, I wonder where other space he's ever had the opportunity to say that to anyone else, to himself. Because again, we see this monologue that he has of talking about all of the things that he's doing, and then things start to shift after that. So I also wonder too, if like there was all the things happening beforehand that we're talking about, then the realization and the vulnerability and the human connection of, okay, this is what I'm going through. And then again, it's kind of filling in the blanks here, but we're assuming that he's no longer going out and drinking and sleeping with all the women and all that now that he's kind of like found this connection with Amanda. But I really think it's almost like a realistic, not everyone does that, but it's almost like it's showing you all of the parts of how this can be messy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, we as therapists and on this podcast a lot, we talk a lot about how, people are so resourceful. Like they are so good at getting their needs met. And I would be curious with him, like what need this is meeting for him. And it might be a need to not deal with it, to not, maybe he's not ready to grieve or to process his grief in quite an emotional way. Like maybe this is a space that he can just be a guy that, goes out and has a good time and doesn't have to think about all these other things. I don't know. But that's kind of what it struck me as too. Like, okay, so he's being really resourceful. He's being pretty kind of quote unquote adaptive, given what he's been kind of hit with. And the other thing that it was just making me think, as you were saying, is part of the aspect that we can't ignore is gender and culture. He is a man, and there are all sorts of preconceived notions about what men are quote unquote allowed to do with their feelings, what's acceptable and what's not. And I'm not super familiar with British culture, but they do culturally tend to be a lot more buttoned up around emotion than we are here in the US. And so I think with those two things in mind, I am curious about, as you were just saying, like, did he really have the space, the permission, so to speak, to actually be vulnerable with his emotions? I don't know.
Yeah. I'm also really happy that you brought up the aspect of like culture and gender and their expectations on grief, because again, it reminds me of sometimes, inaccurately, the intuitive versus instrumental grief can be gendered. Like a lot of times people might think like the intuitive, like females typically tend to feel their feelings and males tend to go out and do the thing. And so I'm wondering, like alongside you, did he see going out and drinking and sleeping with women and doing all of those things as an instrumental style of grieving? Was that the only socially acceptable way for him, consciously or unconsciously, because of societal pressures, for him to process this grief?
Another character I wanted to bring up is Arthur. Arthur's in a much later stage of grief. We see him talk about his late wife with a lot of admiration, and he just talks about these happy memories that he had, honestly, about his wife, but then also about his past abilities and his career. And so yeah, I'm just curious about what you thought about Arthur and how he was grieving.
Yes. Well, I loved Arthur. Such an adorable character and a really meaningful example of grief, in that it seemed like, at least what stood out to me with his relationship to grief and loss. Yes, he talks about his late wife, and it's beautiful to listen to. And it sounds like the grief that he might have been struggling with more was the grief of his like able-bodiedness, like walking up the stairs to get onto the stage for his event seemed to be and not just that, but just showing up, the loss of youth, the loss of everything that comes with that. Because as you can see, he's been throwing those letters in the garbage to go to this big event that was honoring him. And it seemed like what was holding him back was everyone seeing him on stage, with the walk. Like, I think he described it as like the old man with the walker, and he didn't want to be seen that way. And so even though he had lost his wife, it seemed like that had been something that he had processed and worked through, and he was still struggling. But Kate Winslet's character, Iris, kind of really helped him to move through that and to build the confidence. And it just shows the importance of support and people who care and will listen at any and every stage of our life, and how different things that we grieve, like we were talking about earlier in the podcast about loss, and how they are also very much grief when we talk about like loss of able-bodiedness or loss of certain roles or abilities or our youth. That's what really stood out with Arthur for me.
Yeah. And I thank you for highlighting all of those losses too. And that, gosh, such a fave, that man. But yeah, I mean, and so much of what can be challenging with loss is loss of our role, right? And so that seemed to be what he was really contending with a lot. And with Iris's help, he was able to have like a reestablished sense of role and purpose. And that was really helpful to his healing. And yeah, it was really just beautiful to see.
Oh, the holiday.
Yes. Still good all these years later.
All these years later. It does. It does. Even the blockbuster scene. I mean, who doesn't miss a blockbuster scene?
You're talking about the like the trailer?
No, no. When Iris and Miles are in Blockbuster.
I know. So when he's singing, I love Jack Black. Oh, I love him. It was funny to see him in like a more serious role too.
Yeah.
Right. But still be Jack Black.
Still be
him with the singing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this was so fun having a guest in Reactivity TV. Yeah. Thank you for applying your grief lens, your therapist lens to this movie. Wow, this is great. You can come on Reactivity TV anytime, Jess.
Oh my God, please. I would love to. I'll get into The Bachelor. Like,
yes. Okay. You heard it here.
Great. The season starts January 21st, maybe, I think.
Yeah, something around that. Yeah, get ready.
So you have some time.
Perfect.